And welcome to Candidates Corner on LPTV, Libertarian Party Television, a production of the Libertarian Party and Libertarian National Committee. Whitney Bilyeu serving as chair. As always, tonight we've got John Gapso on the big board. He's the one that, sort of brings the buzz, the pictures, the illustrations, the graphics, the ancient newspaper articles, whatever it is that brings to life the story, if you will, and the backstory of the candidate and the district or the town or the municipality or the council or whatever madness has been imposed on us by state and local government and the position they're running for. I'm your host, Pat Ford. There are a few purposes for this show. As always, every week we want to remind folks, we want to give the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian community an opportunity to meet our wonderful down ballot candidates. Folks, the future is now. We hear complaints, ruminations, fulminations, if you will, about the absence of a quote-unquote bench. Balderdash, I say. We have got an outstanding bench. In the year and a half that I've been doing this show, I have literally met a couple of 100 Libertarian candidates, and they are outstanding. They are committed to their community. They understand the issues. They work their off, delivering to their community, their state, again, their town council, their board of education, their water board, and tonight, and perhaps one of the more unique shows that we've ever done, their conservation board. The issues that ordinary folks are facing, but as we like to remind them through a libertarian perspective, because we want them to channel what we call lunch pail voter issues through that libertarian prism. I think it's fair to say that the fine folks of Artesia, New Mexico, we're going to talk with a candidate with tonight, have a great deal of concerns. None of them have anything to do with Austrian economics, our statement of principles, our platform, whatever. That can come later. But again, what we want that folks to do, our candidates, is to reach out to folks who are outside of the libertarian bubble. Yes, that means being face forward. We've run into every issue imaginable, and it differs by community. Part of the important part of being a libertarian candidate is putting those listening ears and going out into the community and understanding what their concerns are. As we always say very often, the candidates that we introduce tonight are often the ones introducing the libertarian philosophy, movement, statement of principles, platform to the greater community. But to gain that initial level of acceptance, we have to work with folks on their terms, what issues that concerns them, and provide them our perspective on exactly how to solve those issues. Not through governance, that's a dirty word here. We don't use the word govern here, we use the word steward. Of equal importance, it is our mission here to promote, if you will, a bond, a recognition that, in this case, the libertarian candidate who's running for office in New Mexico is profoundly important. Just as important as the candidate running perhaps from Boston, New Hampshire, Florida, Washington State. Because each and every time our candidate's hard work presents us with an opportunity to explain the movement, to present to folks our underlying principles, what the statement of principle means, what our platform means. And for that, we should be eternally grateful because candidates deliver messages that are received with an urgency by citizens across this country in a manner in which no other way they can be displayed. All the world's a stage, and candidates have a unique place on that stage. Joining us tonight, Andrew Kennedy. He is a libertarian from the great state of New Mexico, Artesia, New Mexico. He is running, and are you ready for this, folks, to be the Central Valley Soil and Water Conservation District Board Supervisor number 3. Outside of Eric Muldore's run to be a commissioner, if you will, for a mass transportation district, this is one of the most unique. And also, we always remind ourselves of Kim Ruff's runs to be the mine commissioner of Arizona. This is as unique a case as we're going to see. But at the same time, there is an amazing opportunity here. Depending on who you speak with, this nation is either A, about to embrace head on a climate crisis, or on other parts of the electorate are about to embrace a single hoax. And there's a lot of opinions and shades of gray in between. But one of the biggest challenges the libertarian movement has faced is explaining ourselves, never mind running for a position that involves the word conservation. We are pilloried in certain circles because the assumption is we want nothing more than to turn America into a gigantic ashtray. When, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Because as libertarians, we breathe the same air, we drink the same water, our children play in the same fields. We want the same things that all Americans do, that all people want. But Mr. Kennedy has decided that he is going to be the man to tackle this. Andrew Kennedy, thank you for joining us tonight. Full confession, we know each other offline from a variety of shared perspectives that we both engage in politically and some activism that we are joining together in. So this isn't the first time we've met, if you will. It's the first time we've met a little bit more than pure virtually. But welcome to the show. And again, thank you for running for office.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me on. I'm glad to be here tonight.
This is outstanding. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, a question that we ask all guests is, what was their libertarian moment? That sort of, if you're a fan, well, if you grew up on 1960s and 70s eras cartoon, when the light bulb went up over a Roadrunner or Bugs Bunny's head, we've all had that libertarian moment, that epiphany. What was yours?
Well, so when I was growing up, I knew that I never really identified as a Republican or Democrat. I mean, I came from a very heavily Republican background, in which honestly, when I was at the age of 7 or 8, when my parents explained what taxes were to me and what each party's main stance was on it, they explained, Democrats want more taxes and Republicans want less taxes. Well, my thoughts were, why do you even want taxes in the first place? But, still, I didn't really know what I was until I got into high school. And ironically enough, I went to a public high school in Texas. And my sophomore year of English class, we had a required reading of Anthem by Ayn Rand. And we read through it. And after I read it, I was like, man, this book really spoke to me. I like it. And I went and I researched more about Ayn Rand, however you want to say it. And when I was 14 years old, that's when I decided, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a Libertarian.
How did that go over with your classmates and your teachers?
So funny enough, my sophomore year English teacher, her whole take on Anthem itself was that the book was about the bond and the love between the main character and the primary secondary character in the book. And I was like, no, that's not the take that this book is pushing at all. It's about individualism. So right off the bat, I was already at conflicts with my teacher that assigned the reading. And then I had a lot of classmates because, I grew up in a very rural town in Texas. I mean, you can't even really find it on most road maps. So, it was a very Republican, conservative area, but a lot of my classmates knew about Ron Paul. This was in the mid 2010s, when he was fairly visible still. So, they were open to the ideas. And once, I kind of pitched Ron Paul towards them and said, hey, I like some of his ideas and we can build upon them. When they asked me what my political philosophy was later on, then they weren't quite as hostile towards me. But initially, if you just said you weren't a Republican, then obviously, that's a definite no until you explained, what you were about.
We all read about football in Texas, and
So funny enough, my school was actually so small, we didn't have a football team. We didn't even have a 6-man football team.
Holy cow! So no Friday night lights?
No, sir. Our big thing was basketball.
Holy cow! I had this whole shtick built up on football.
Yeah, and honestly, my first year in high school playing basketball, we had so few guys. We only had one alternate on the team, so we only had 6 guys on our entire team for basketball. So it was a very small town.
There you go. And was there a lot of room for sort of political experimentation that young people should absolutely go to?
I mean, in honesty, like where I grew up, the Libertarian Party was not really known. It wasn't pushed. I don't even know if there was a county affiliate there at that time or even now, to be honest. So I mean, outside as far as politics, you basically had being pushed by everybody around you. Republicans good, Democrats bad. And I was just sitting there. It's like well, I kind of get some of what the Republicans are saying, but obviously it's not. They didn't take it to the logical conclusions that libertarians do.
Right. Now let's talk about the job itself.
Yes,
Give us a breakdown of the description, because I want to tell folks in other parts of the nation, in Texas and New Mexico and the deep Southwest, water, let's just say we take it for granted in New England, particularly this year, because we've got plenty of it. And it's sort of a cruel joke. While we're getting literally bombarded, inches of rain at a time, there are parts of the country for whom water is a precious commodity, particularly those parts of the country that are involved with livestock and agriculture. And the challenges that one faces as a result are both real and existential. And on a political level, it's highly, highly charged. There is a great deal of, if you will, controversy. How about that? Between those groups. Well, let's call it 3 groups: environmentalists and outdoors folks. You've got livestock, and then you've got agriculture. And right now, in many parts of the country, we're talking about a question of fundamental survival for all of those different vested interest groups. So into that highly charged environment, you pursue this job. Is it as heavily politicized in your community as it is in other parts of the Southwest and in the far West?
Yeah, I mean, in my community here, this is definitely a very Republican-leaning stronghold for sure. I mean, this is one of the biggest Republican strongholds in the entire state of New Mexico. So based off of that, we can kind of assume what most of the public's perception of I guess you could say, the greater climate debate would be, which I'm not here to debate that at all tonight. I mean, whether that's an issue or not, that's several pay grades above mine, and I'm not even going to speak on it. In which, honestly, from the office that I'm running for, I couldn't do anything about it. And that's one thing that you're going to find about me, is if it's something that I can't do anything about, I may have opinions on it, but I'm not going to state it as that's my campaign stances.
Right. So what is the day-to-day role of this position?
So the Soil and Water Conservation Boards, there's actually, in the state of New Mexico, basically every square inch of the state just about is covered by some form of Soil or Water Conservation Board. There are some areas that don't have them, but their primary purpose is to protect the waterways, the rivers, streams, main runoffs, things like that. Which through here in this district, we have the Pecos River running through, which is at one of its southernmost points in the entire state of New Mexico before it hits the Rio Grande River. So we do have a large volume of water moving through this district on the daily. And then plus too, there are situations where the Soil and Water Conservation Board does deal with, we have a lot of public lands out here. So certain topics, when it comes to just the preservation of whether it's the state or the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management lands out here, they also deal with that. Not quite as much as one might think, being that's just not even a county level office. It's about half of a county that the district is in. So they're not as involved as, say, the state land commission is, but they are somewhat involved in decisions on public lands out here.
Outstanding. Now, and how many, is this one representative per county, or are there 3 or 4, and do you run as a Libertarian, or is this,
So
non-sectarian?
this is technically a nonpartisan race, but I am running with full backing of LP&M and several other libertarian groups. And I'm fairly open about the fact that I am running as a libertarian candidate. If people in the constituency do ask me if I have a party preference, party affiliation, I do tell them that, I am a libertarian.
And do the other candidates do that as well? Is it clear, crystal clear, who's running as a Republican and who's running as a Democrat?
Yeah, right now, unless there's been a write-in candidate put forward, there's only the incumbent as the opponent, and he is a Republican. And it's pretty well taken for granted, for the most part, that if someone was running for an office around here, if they don't specify what they are, they're a Republican.
Interesting. And because I don't think, obviously, and as you pointed out to and stipulated to, I don't think of New Mexico as a Republican state at all. I've only been there a couple of times. It's a spectacular place with unimaginable beauty and wonderful people, wonderful food. In fact, if you haven't visited, you must, because of the absence of really a tourist environment in a great deal of the state. It's just an astonishing place to visit. But I would never have imagined in a million years that there would be a hardcore Republican output. Were they overtly pro-Trump as well in that part of the state?
Yes, there's also still plenty of Trump 2020 flags up, and I'm also seeing some Trump 2024 flags coming up as well. And the thing about like New Mexico is, to the national stage, we come off as a very Democratic state, and that is because of the Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Las Cruces voting areas, and that they're Democrat to the core. And the thing is that the Albuquerque metro area by itself makes up over a quarter of the entire state's population.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you get out into the rural areas where I live, it's very Republican, but the thing is people are open to libertarian ideas. Typically they support the Republican Party because they've been taught and they've been told that all Republicans favor smaller government, which we all know that that's an absolute lie.
Interesting.
But so, and that's why Gary Johnson was able to have so much success here in the state. I mean, I know that he is somewhat a divisive figure in the LP, but that's why he was able to have as much success as he was here in the state, because people aren't quite as vehemently opposed to non-Democrat or non-Republican ideas.
By the way, I have to ask, because I've only run into a handful of New Mexico libertarians, mainly just because of geography, not because they aren't a great chapter and a great party and are very active. What is, from your perception, from what you see politically in the state, someone who's running as a candidate, not so much from the internal libertarian perspective, but from perspective at large, does Gary Johnson still have a strong legacy in New Mexico, and do people think of him as a libertarian?
I mean, I would definitely say that if you mention the name Gary Johnson, that most people would think of a libertarian here in the state. Although in the past few years, he's kind of retreated from the public political eye here. But like I said, I would definitely say that people would consider him a libertarian if you brought him up in conversation here.
Excellent. So let's talk about the job. And as I mentioned almost every week, there is a little bit of a formula to the show, but it works, I think. I get to spend quality time with, and I love reading local newspapers, but I had never read the Artesia Daily Press before. And it's a true confession. I'll admit that. And I may continue to, because of the wealth of material. One of the articles, and I'm going back to 2018, talks about, how differently Texas and New Mexico treat water. And they talk about, and I'll read the first little bit. After you head northeast on Ranch Road 652 from tiny Orla, Texas, it's easy to miss the precise moment you leave for Texas and cross into New Mexico. The sign says Leah County line, and with 254 counties in Texas, you'd be forgiven not knowing that there isn't one named Leah. But the folks who are selling water over it know exactly where the line is. And what happens here in Texas, they got something called the rule of capture rules, which means if the water's under your land, go for it. Go crazy. Whereas New Mexico takes a much tighter and much more restrictive look on that. What's your thoughts about that? Your exposure to that type of material already, and is that a big deal in where you are in New Mexico?
Right. So touching on water rights here in the state, they're kind of handled a lot like how people be familiar with mineral rights being handled in most other states.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you go and you buy property, you're buying surface rights, mineral rights, and water rights. And if you don't have the water rights to that property, or somebody else has them and they're unwilling to sell them to you, that the buyer does, or that the current seller doesn't have, you're stuck between a rock and a hard spot. And one thing that people do, which this will sound very odd and somewhat ridiculous to a lot of people outside of the state, is you can actually buy water rights to another property in a completely different county on the other side of the state, transfer the water rights to the property you just bought, and then you can pump water out of your wells.
Holy
So,
cow!
yeah, that is a little bit of an odd system. And then also something else that is very odd, being that you mentioned water in Texas, is that since the Pecos River that runs through the district here that I'm running for goes into the Rio Grande River, there is a contract that was signed actually back before New Mexico was even a state. It's signed between the state of Texas and the territory of New Mexico, that a
Mhm.
certain gallon volume amount every year is supposed to flow from the Pecos River into the Rio Grande in Texas. And the way that the state of New Mexico keeps this contract within its required boundaries is they will actually force anybody who has farmland along the Pecos River to dump a certain volume that they, percentage of volume that they pull up from their water wells into the river, and they're not compensated for it. But if they don't do that, they're fined.
All right, so let's go through that one more time with feeling. So what you're telling me, okay, first of all, the Pecos River, uh, define the geography there. It's a little challenging for those of us from the Northeast who water rights consist of, if you paid the bill, you turn on the faucet.
Right.
A
So, I mean,
completely different existence.
right. The overall geography here, it's a complete desert environment. I mean, my house is nestled in between a whole bunch of sand dunes. And the Pecos River originates in the very southern end of the Rocky Mountains up around the Raton Taos area north of Santa Fe.
Okay.
And it cuts south and it runs through the plains of central New Mexico into the desert down here. And all along that stretch, anyone who has private property that is pulling water out of a water well all the way from the origin point to when the river actually leaves the state of New Mexico is where they're actually metering water to be dumped into the Pecos River in order to fulfill a contract that was signed before the New Mexico is even a state, which New Mexico was made a state in 1912.
Wow. Okay. To heighten the interest in this little border war we've got here on water, and this is fascinating, right? This is in a 2018 newspaper article. I'm going to quote: "Texas is stealing New Mexico's water," said New Mexico State Land Commissioner Aubrey Dunn. You put a whole bunch of straws in Texas and you don't have any straws in New Mexico, you're sucking all the water from under New Mexico out in Texas and then selling it back to New Mexico. Now, first of all, if you could talk to us about Aubrey Dunn, because that is a known name, well known to some libertarians, but perhaps not given it credit enough. What is the legacy of Mr. Dunn and his accomplishments?
Um, Honestly, I got involved with the LPNM a little bit after Mr. Dunn was involved with the Land Commission up in Santa Fe.
Mm-hmm.
Since my time being involved, he's run for the he ran for nomination for our backing for the special election to replace the Region One, I believe it was Region One representative for U.S. Congress. So, I mean, as far as the exact legacy that he had in the State Land Commission, I cannot speak on that myself.
But does this problem still exist, though, in terms of New Mexico
Yes,
versus Texas?
yes, it does. And the thing is Texas is expecting New Mexico to supply all of the water, because if you go up to where the Rio Grande cuts through New Mexico, it goes from Albuquerque down through Las Cruces and on into Texas around El Paso. If you go out to like Las Cruces at the state border crossing out there, there's almost no water right now going through the Rio Grande. So pretty much all the water that's actually ending up in the valley in Texas where they grow all of the fruits and the vegetables, most of that water is actually coming from the Pecos River.
Wow. And such is the stuff not too long ago where border wars, excuse me, could ensue. Now, the $1 million question, of course, is, we spoke about Mr. Dunn as the land commissioner. What role, if any, does the position that you're running for have in oversight of that, and then what are its other responsibilities?
So the Soil and Water Conservation Board actually would have no say in that particular dispute that is between the state governments.
Mm-hmm.
The Soil and Water Conservation Board's purview is more in actually conserving the specific waterways themselves, making sure that they're not victims to erosion, they're not, having contaminants dumped into them, things along that nature as far as the waterways go.
And then what do you vote on that? Do you vote on regulations? What's the next logical step of that?
Yeah, so in this district, there are actually 4 board supervisors, and they function similarly to a town council or city council or a county commission. And whereas every supervisor votes, and that's their decision on what action needs to be taken or not taken.
Mm-hmm. And what traditionally have they intervened in, and what are your thoughts on the style of intervention that they've engaged in?
So the intervention, typically, like I said, it's more of just if there's a major runoff spot and sides of the river are being eroded, or there's a bridgeway that's being eroded, that's when they step in typically.
Mm-hmm.
There hasn't really been much of a problem, at least in recent news, of anybody really contaminating the waterways specifically, at least in this district. I can't speak to if it's happened in any other districts, because there's generally at least like 2 or 3 of these soil and water conservation districts for every county in New Mexico, and there's 33 counties. So what other boards have taken action on, I can't say specifically, but
does that have an impact on things like zoning, construction permits, issues like that?
Typically not. The construction permits out here are actually issued by the state government if it's outside of a city area.
Okay.
So one place that they come in at is, like I said, it's typically just with the actual waterways, and then on public lands is usually where Soil and Water Conservation Board gets involved. In which on public lands, since they're owned by the government, nobody's going to be building out there other than the government, so they're just going to rubber stamp through whatever they want.
Right. My experience on the handful of times that I've driven across New Mexico is that you've got large swaths of land that are unincorporated. Is that true in your part of the state?
Yes, the vast majority of the county that I live in is all under the domain of either the New Mexico State Land Office or the Bureau of Land Management. Very little of this county is actually either privately owned or part of a city or an incorporation. And
when you talk about BLM, all right, it's a different BLM. Bureau of Land Management, excuse me, does play an outsized role. And again, this is foreign to folks in New England who've set up their own governmental structures in order to restrict our personal freedoms. BLM is typically not one of them. And in fact, I don't even know if there's any land under BLM management up in New England. It'd be an interesting thing to find out. But what role does BLM take in the lives of ordinary New Mexicans and folks who might be involved in industry or construction?
Yeah, so the Bureau of Land Management has the most effect, at least in this area, on people involved in agriculture, specifically ranching, and in the oil and gas industry. Because the vast majority of the oil and gas leases out here are actually on Bureau of Land Management or state land office owned land.
Mm-hmm.
So, for the people who just, work a, more regular standard job in town, BLM or state land office doesn't really have much impact in their lives. But if you're tied to oil and gas or livestock specifically, both of them do have quite a impact in your income out here.
So what you've got in New Mexico, just to put it in perspective, is you've got a half a dozen competing governmental organizations that have a lot of control individually and in the aggregate over folks who are involved somehow in either livestock mining or construction or development or the use of land in general. How painful is this as someone perhaps trying to do business in New Mexico?
It can get really complicated really fast, especially if you're in an area where there are a lot of different land offices, because we also have the U.S. military owns land down here, not in this area, but in the state of New Mexico. The Forestry Service has land, the National Park Service has land. So you can get in a bind where you're having to deal with 5, 6, 7 government agencies really quick, depending on where you're at here.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And this is in contrast to the state right next door, where it appears to, particularly to someone from the Northeast, that deregulation is part of your life. How does that work out economically in terms of competing for jobs, competing for business? You know, you've always got state on state, what I call economic crime, taking place around the country. How much of that is an issue?
Yeah, I mean, even just, you look at just oil and gas alone, pretty much all of the major oil and gas industry around here is centered out of either Midland or Odessa, Texas. It's not here in this field. Even though there is just as much reserve, if potentially not more than what there is in Texas, it's just simply how hard it is for companies to acquire leases and set up offices out here, and really, for everybody to benefit from those resources. Because, for example, the state of Texas, 97% of all land in Texas is owned by some sort of private entity, whether that's an individual, company, whatever. Only 3% is owned by a government agency, and the vast majority of that is state parks, and the remainder of it is basically a few national wildlife refuges and Big Bend. Whereas in New Mexico, over 70% of the state of New Mexico is owned by some sort of government entity. So, their reluctance to allow the actual usage, responsible usage of these resources here definitely hurts us. Granted, yes, we do have one of the smallest populations in the country, even though we're the 5th largest state by land mass.
Right.
So, that is a factor, but still, factoring that in, we have one of the weakest economies in the entire country, even though we have plenty of natural resources.
Right. And getting back to the Gary Johnson question before you focus on your campaign efforts, perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Gary Johnson's legacy was that he was such an effective governor. By today's libertarian standards, some would argue that he wasn't nearly libertarian enough. I will just say, as someone who is perhaps a little bit more of a seasoned citizen than some, he was remarkably libertarian for the time period that he occupied, nearly revolutionary. And he entered office in a very poor state with a staggering deficit and left with a surplus, and managed to cut taxes and do all sorts of crazy stuff while maintaining, if you will, the quality of life, if not enhancing the quality of life of the people of New Mexico. So it's just a little bit of editorialization there, agreed, but I think it's an important perspective as we talk about New Mexico. Now, folks, if you're just joining by this way, Andrew Kennedy is here. He is running to be the Central Valley Soil and Water Conservation District Board Supervisor number 3. He lives in the parish, if you will, of New Mexico, and that is Artesia, New Mexico. And again, we just had a dramatic interpretive reading with interpretive dance of the Artesia Daily Press. One of the aspects I love about this show. Let's talk about your campaign now. It's interesting because, again, and I understand that your focus is on the actual aspects of the job of the board, and that's admirable, because very often folks are woefully undereducated about, and we all, not because they can't understand, is that civics is not a big part of the Americans' lives anymore. Americans' lives have denigrated to what I call short-term attention theater. So when you get into these boards, which are so important to the operation of big government, they're woefully impaired. So how often when you campaign do people try to transform this into a conversation on global warming?
I haven't had that a ton because, typically most people don't even know what the Soil and Water Conservation Board is. A lot of people don't even know there's an election going on this year.
Mm-hmm.
So once I explain, what the board is about, what they do, very rarely does it go into a greater discussion outside of the purview of the board, although that does happen. And when it does, I basically just say, well, from the position I'm running for, I can't really do anything about that. So I'm gonna have to decline making commentary on that.
What method do you employ in campaigning for a job that may be very important, but not quite as front and center as, say, town council or school board? Are you going door to door? Are you using social media? How are you approaching your campaign?
So I mean, we're approaching more of a grassroots take on it. Putting out flyers at the post offices, putting them out on the street corner signs, wherever we can throw a flyer up. That's what we're going for. We've got a plan to go out and put up a whole bunch of yard sized signs along the highway, which is fairly easy to do because there's only a few access points in and out of every town out here. So, put up a few signs, you can cover pretty much anybody going in and out of town. Sorry, did I interrupt?
No. No, please keep going. This is the kind of nuts and bolts conversation we try to have with each candidate so we can understand different approaches to these different board positions, as opposed to, again, like I said, front-facing positions like city council. Is your opponent, and I guess it's just the beauty of this situation, it's a one-on-one race. Is your opponent campaigning aggressively? Has he realized what a heat-seeking missile you are and what your campaign represents?
So, as of right now, I have not seen any campaigning from either of the incumbents because both board supervisor number 3 and 4 are up for election this year.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not seen any campaigning from either one of them yet. And typically that is the way that these races go, because in 2019, when the election for supervisor number 1 and 2 were held, only 417 people actually voted in the entire election.
Wow, because that was you led right into my next question. This is 417 out of a total voting population of.
We're looking for the district here so Artesia is the main town. You're looking at a population of between 10 and 11,000, and then with the outlying communities and everything, you're looking at probably 13 to 14,000 people.
Holy cow! So 400 people make or break this race.
Right. I mean, essentially 200 votes are what decided the last election.
Huh. In a number of occasions, we've had folks from Pennsylvania on, including their state chair, and we talk about maneuver-like races, how important the devil is in the detail, and establishing ourselves as viable stewards of community resources. Again, we don't use the word government. This is the perfect job to put a libertarian into, because, again, there's an oversight role here. And as someone who's not looking to expand government, ostensibly, that oversight role can be very, very important. There's a common sense approach to it. Will there be any debates or any public conversation had in terms of this office?
As far as with my opponent for office, if he is willing and open to a debate or a forum, I am more than happy to engage with him on that.
Mm-hmm.
Although, unfortunately, one of the problems that a lot of these soil and water boards face is they don't do a very good job of informing the public, number one, of what they're doing, number two, what their purpose is, and number three, what decisions they've made. And because if you go and you look at the Central Valley Water and Soil Conservation Board, you basically, the only info for contact you can find on them is a phone number for their office. That's it. There's no social media presence. There's no website saying, what they're up to, what they're doing, what decisions they've made.
Right.
And that's kind of one of my campaign platforms is I want the public to be able to engage with these boards and see, what they're doing, what they're spending money on, why they felt they needed to spend money on it, and then what each supervisor's, at least from my perspective, I will certainly go out and say, if I'm elected, this is what I voted for, this is why I voted for this in the board meeting, etc.
I believe one of the side effects, if you will, of the quote unquote pandemic is that individuals, because so many folks have been sequestered in their homes, have taken, let's just say, a more aggressive, shall we say, jaundiced view of their government because, quite frankly, they've had the time to do it. And are folks starved for that type of information in your community?
I really feel like it is because, I mean, even as a candidate with my campaign volunteer staff, it is hard for us to find any information that's actually useful to our campaign about this position, in all honesty.
Wow.
So for the general public who just, is taking a passing glance possibly at the office, they're getting basically no information on what this board is actually doing, what they're spending money on, why they're even getting taxpayer funding.
Are their meetings public? Are they recorded?
Their meetings are public, but the thing is they don't have a website or anything that they post them to. So if you know where they are and when they are, you can just walk into them and view them. But you can't go back after the fact really very easily and see what decisions they made. So it's very hard for the constituency to hold their representatives accountable for what decisions they've made.
And I assume you're campaigning to change that.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
And
go
one
ahead,
of the things. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, no, you please. It's one of the joys of StreamYard is that occasionally we're going to bounce over each other, but continue, please.
Yeah, no, and just going into taxpayer funding for the board in general and everything, the board itself is not compensated in a traditional role that you would think of most government positions because they really only have one meeting a month. So they're not devoting a ton of their time to their role. But what they are compensated with generally is a per diem and a mileage cost incurred for attending their meetings. But one thing that they can also do, which is very odd because it's not an actual salaried position, the board can elect to provide for themselves, their spouses, and any dependents that they have health insurance for themselves on taxpayer money. And that is something that I'm very vehemently opposed to, especially for the fact that your job basically requires 1 day a month. The taxpayer should not be buying your entire family health care.
Right. How do people react when you tell them that?
Everybody that I've told that to is very surprised by the fact that the board is not paid in a traditional sense, but they can get health care off of taxpayer funding, which in all honesty makes no sense whatsoever. Because
Right.
you'd never walk into a job and the job say, well, we're going to pay you a per diem and mileage and then healthcare, but nothing else.
And to be blunt, that's worth a significant amount of money. I mean, depending on if you, as I do, work in the dreaded free enterprise, free market, small business world, free healthcare for a family can be $100,000 a year expense.
Oh yeah, easily. I mean, even if it's just a single person that's on the plan, you can be spending a lot of money really quick, and then you have 4 board supervisors. If they have sizable families, we can be talking about spending a lot of money really fast.
Wow. And so in lies, if you will, the true motivation for so many of our public, and we're using the candidates corner air quotes, public service. Astonishing. Where is it that you need help in making your candidacy successful? Is it volunteers? Is it money? What are some of the things that you need to be successful?
I mean, more volunteers would always be welcomed. I've already got a pretty good volunteer staff right now. One of our things that we really need is funding. We have gotten some funding from a few groups within the Libertarian Party already and a few individuals. And we're finalizing setting up our donation system and everything that should be up and running tonight. If anybody's interested in that, if you want to go to my campaign Facebook page and message the page, I will respond almost immediately if I'm awake, and I can let you know the status on that. That's our biggest thing because, like I said, we want to put out yard-sized signs along the highway. Another thing that we really want to do is get a bunch of door hangers and put those out all across town, and just basically inform people of I'm running, what I'm about, and then honestly when the election is and where to vote for it, because if you only have 3 to 4% of the entire constituency turning out to vote in the last election, informing the public of when and where the election is should help quite a bit.
Absolutely. And this is by the way, when is the election date?
November 2nd. And early voting opens in mid-October.
The dreaded early voting gives folks an opportunity to get their ballot so that they don't have to waste any time learning about the election. Great stuff. How to use ballot maneuvers to ensure the machine's continued success. Oof. Well, again, give us the, we engage at this point in the show in what we call shameless self-promotion. So go through what sites you've got up and what sites you anticipating being up shortly. Yeah,
so there should soon be a website up, and you can find that off of the Facebook page. The Facebook page is what's most active out of any of our social media accounts because I run that myself. Right. There have been some other accounts set up. I know Instagram for sure. I believe Twitter is being set up right now, but I'm not on either of those platforms myself. That's my volunteer team running that stuff. So I can't speak personally as to how far along they're on that, but.
Excellent. And run through the Facebook page one more time.
The Facebook page is just my name right now. It's just Andrew Kennedy. And, it's got a picture of me, guy in sport coat, tie, and black cowboy hat. That's me.
So you are all cowboy, not just the hat. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I come from several generations of both agriculture people and oil and gas. I'm fourth generation oil and gas, and agriculture goes back about 7 generations in my family here in the U.S.
Wow.
One of my earliest memories actually is sitting on my granddad's knee, quote unquote, helping him drive his 90-horse Fiat tractor, and we were cutting hay. And I was about a year old then.
Now you've worked in the oil fields?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I've been involved in ag, running my own business in it since I was about 14, specifically with livestock and hay production. And then I've been involved in the oil and gas industry since I was 19. So I've got a few years under my belt on both sides.
And what do you do? What do you do on the oil and gas side?
So oil and gas, I'm involved in the actual production of petroleum or crude oil, of actually bringing it out of the ground and getting it ready to be sent to the refineries.
And how big of an industry is that in your part of New Mexico? Because again, for many of us, New Mexico is one of these interesting remote places that we just, we're not flying in and out of it per se. If we're in that part of the country, we're probably going to either Phoenix or Dallas, Fort Worth. So I would hazard to guess that a significant number of party members have never been to New Mexico, and a lot of them that have might have been because of the Gary Johnson presidential campaigns. What, Dan Lewis, yeehaw. All right, Lewis, hush. He's one of those city slickers, right?
Yeah, I know how Dan is. I've met Dan before, so.
Yeah. How big is oil and gas where you live?
Oil and gas makes up the vast majority of the economy in not just this county, but this region of the state. And then the second biggest industry is agriculture itself. So.
And are we talking gas? Are we talking fracked, tar sand style, or are we talking old, sweet Texas? What style of energy is coming out of the ground where you are?
A little bit of both. We still do have some vertical sweet gas wells around here. But all of the recent drilling has all been horizontal frac.
Interesting. Well, again, you provide us a perspective on a number of different industries and lifestyles that, typically we don't run into in the libertarian movement because, so many of us are, from the coast, if you will, from the larger cities. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. And your perspective is extremely valuable because you're seeing firsthand in the state of New Mexico the impact of big government. In New England, where I live, you don't see obviously BLM. Unless you're in the Rochester, New York area or the northern climes of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, you don't see immigration. You're somewhat inoculated from big federal government, with the exception of that which we've imposed on ourselves, sadly enough. So it's, first of all, as always, we take an opportunity to thank people who are running for office. As I've said literally about 120 times or so on this show, running for political office is, short of acting in the defense of our nation, emphasis defense, one of the most patriotic things that you can do, because you're standing up, you're willing to take that chance and, take time away from your family and your businesses and the easy fun that can be had by a young man, and you're willing to sacrifice that on behalf of your community and of individual liberty, because folks who run for office as libertarians are ultimately fighting for the rights of the ultimate minority in this country, and that's the individual. So my hat's off to you, and I hope that this is the beginning of a long, strange adventure, if you will, running for office successfully and rising to the highest levels, if you will, of power in American government and the Mexican government, for the simple fact that you will then leave everybody the hell alone. And
I am diligently plotting to take over the state of New Mexico so I can leave everybody alone.
Excellent. Well, I have to say this, Andrew, it is an absolute pleasure working alongside of you in some of the efforts that we've been involved in. Your commitment to the cause and your willingness to engage in self-sacrifice of time and effort is astonishing. And I'm thrilled to see you running for office. And I hope we do everything we can as a party to support your efforts in a part of the country that, since Gary and Aubrey have sort of faded in to a little bit of memory, noble efforts that they did, that screams out for a libertarian presence. And there's a great party in New Mexico. I've often told my trip down to New Mexico to Deming to work briefly on the immigration issue. And there's great libertarian folks. When we're going to share around as soon as his contribution signs up, again, please, a few dollars from a bunch of sources will take a lot of pressure off of Mr. Kennedy and his campaign workers. It'll make it that much easier for him to grab that important foothold in New Mexican politics and the Mexican government. And it's a foothold that I think will pay great dividends for our philosophy. And so again, thank you for joining me tonight. Congratulations on your effort. Please keep us apprised of what you're doing. What we're telling candidates is if you're doing a money bomb or if you've got a big event coming up, let us know. We'll do our best to publicize it and share information about it. And from our perspective, from our little seat here and high above the hills of Providence, Rhode Island, we're going to try and have an impact on, if you will, again, the Paris of New Mexico. And of course, that's Artesia, New Mexico. So thanks, buddy, for joining us.
Appreciate you for having me on.
All right, buddy. Folks, a number of events coming up. If there's still time to head out to Pennsylvania to join Liz Terwilliger, Spike Cohen, Steve Sheets, a whole roster of libertarian heavyweights, if you will. We've got, John, I think we've got next week, we've got an event in New Rochelle, New York for the Libertarian Party of New York. Go out to their Facebook page, sign up. If you can't go, buy a ticket anyway, then don't show up. How about that offer? Help the folks in the Libertarian Party of New York. They and Mr. Sharp have engaged in yeoman efforts in order to attain ballot status, only to have it cruelly taken from them, stolen from them in a duopoly move that we shouldn't be surprised by, because like Lucy, they continue to move the goalposts. They continue to pull the football away because they hate us, because they ain't us. So do whatever you can to support the Libertarian Party of New York. Folks, if you're a candidate and you'd like to appear on Candidate's Corner on LPTV, please reach out to me. My name is Pat Ford. It is a singular honor to spend a little bit of time with you each week in introducing these amazing people from literally around the country. I'm going to take a look over the next week or so. We're closing in on all 50 states, and and then we're just going to do it again as we get closer to the election. And there are elections in November. Please take a moment, invest your time. You have a little bit of extra cash. These are challenging times, but invest it in these candidates. And I say invest because the future is now. Again, there's an amazing group of candidates out there representing our movement, our philosophy, and our statement of principles. Folks, you've been listening and watching Candidates Corner on LPTV, Libertarian Party Television, a production of the Libertarian Party and Libertarian National Committee. Whitney Bilyeu serving as chair. As always, a huge thanks to John Gapso, who volunteers a couple of nights a week to join us here. We're going to, this Monday coming up on the affiliates hour, Monday at 9 o'clock Eastern time, I think we're going to be having Kentucky on. Folks from Kentucky, we're going to talk with them, a little bit of ranked choice voting conversation with their state chair. Please join us then. My name is Pat Ford. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful, safe weekend in Liberty. Good night. We'll see you Monday night.